The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. With me tonight are two young ladies, students at Southern University Law Center, Megan Matt and Chelsea Hale. Megan is passionate about social justice, and upon graduation, she hopes to practice in the fields of criminal defense and civil rights litigation. She is presently a student at Southern University Law Center and has been awarded internships with the Louisiana Law Institute and the Innocence Project. She has recently worked on the transition team of Sharon Weston Broome, who's Baton Rouge's mayor currently. And Chelsea Hale, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, hi, my name is Chelsea Hill. I'm originally from Reno Valley, California. I attended my undergrad at Thomas College in Waterville, Maine, and shout out to my softball ladies who are actually going to be competing later on this week. I have an interest in criminal law, be it on the defense side or on the prosecution side, and I'm also interested in civil rights litigation as well, and that's about it.
Okay, well, that's plenty, actually. I wish I knew that much about what I wanted to be when I grew up, back then, because I still don't know what I want to be. Anyhow, you guys, this is part of the restorative justice program or strategy that you're involved with, right? Tell us your take on what restorative justice is, or what the purpose of bringing up these things are.
Well, restorative justice is a rather than a punitive system, it looks to a holistic system of healing where instead of just blaming an accused person, we try and bring healing to a community and to both the victim and the person who is, the offender, or sometimes if the offender is falsely accused, then bringing healing in that capacity and kind of trying to restore dignity and humanity back. So there's different approaches and ways to do that.
It also provides, I guess, a context, too, for white people to understand how we got to where we are today. Mm-hmm. And what was mentioned on a previous interview, the more you learn about the history of civil rights, of the civil rights struggle in America, the easier it is for you to see patterns in current, modern things. You can pick up on things and say, I know where that comes from, that kind of thing, and that helps.
Definitely.
Education is a powerful thing. All right, and you focused on rape and the disparities between black men and women and white men and women as far as that goes. In fact, Chelsea, in your notes you stated, if ending slavery was to prevent ownership of humans, then we have not ended it yet. Mm-hmm. This is still very much a civil rights struggle. So where'd you start off with this? Can you tell us the history of the rape of black women during slavery?
Well, essentially the rape of black women in the slavery era was non-existent. It wasn't a crime. It wasn't even seen as rape against them. It was them, basically having, sexual intercourse with their masters, which they didn't have a say-so, on what they were able to do or what they weren't able to do. And so they were just recognized as themselves and their bodies being property to white men, and they were able to do whatever they wanted with these black women. So there was history tells us that there's no recognition to black women actually being humane and being human. And it all stems back from the slavery era.
Okay, yeah. And of course, back during slavery, a lot of white people, it's hard for me to believe they actually believe this, but they claim to believe that black people aren't even human. Mm-hmm. So this is justified in what they're doing and all that. They abused black men on the plantations too, but probably not in an intimate way like with rape. That's kind of a special thing. But so slavery was ended and all that stopped, right?
Yeah. So the painting of the African American community as less than human continued for quite some time. They, through the lynching era, through Jim Crow, black men have been seen as sexually deviant monsters and painted that way. African American women have also been seen as painted as Jezebels, and so whenever rape laws even started to evolve, it still did not really, even though they technically included African American women, they did not in practice include African American women because their chastity was connected to whether they could truly be seen as victims of rape. And so if basically they were slut shaming these women, like
right.
A judge even said with that community, you really have to watch them, basically, like that's just what they do to each other or whatever. Like it wasn't even seen, like even Chelsea was saying, nothing changed. It still wasn't ever seen as a crime. Just because maybe on the books it looked like it was now a crime, it was never truly treated as a crime when these women's bodies were still treated like someone else's property.
It was still a crime, just not legally.
Right.
Not correct.
Not practically. Yeah.
Speaking of that, you state that back after slavery, or I guess during slavery, if there were free black women back then. But I have a quote here that from your notes that states, "No Louisiana law made rape of a black woman, slave or free, a crime." So, I mean, I can understand slavery because that distorted everything, but even a free black woman was not protected by the law for rape?
Not for quite some time. Mm-hmm. And then even when it was protected, it wasn't in practice. So even though that's the thing is people look like we've made all this progress over the years, and they're like, oh, well, look at this law that we have. And one thing we've talked about in our class before is that we have all these civil rights acts. What is it, like 10?
Mm-hmm.
And she asked us to look and say, okay, well, what have these actually accomplished? Have these accomplished what they set out to accomplish? And like, yes, they're on the books, and I'm grateful that they're on the books, but in practice, is this really what's happening in our country? And we have to really look and examine that.
Yeah, and passing a law certainly doesn't mean it's going to fix the problem.
Right.
I mean, was it John Kennedy that sent the National Guard down to Alabama to escort black kids to school?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, even when Ruby Bridges had to go to school in New Orleans, the first black child to get to go to school with white kids, that she had to be escorted. There's, tons of pictures. I mean, so it's.
Well, I think it's important to, like in our, project, we've extensively researched, circumstances surrounding the disparities between, African Americans and, whites in the judicial system in regards to rape. And I think history tells us that yes, we have developed laws, yes, we have amended laws and stuff like that. And it's important to note that based on the research that we have found, it's not technically a problem with the laws that we already have in place. It's the way that these laws are being applied and carried out. And then going back to history, saying, in the slavery era, African American women they were seen as property, you know what I mean? So rape against them, even though today we realize that was a crime, back then it wasn't. And we have to understand that leading back to the existence, leading back to slavery and even before then, if you will, it's the psychological trauma that has carried from the slavery era into the Reconstruction era, into the Jim Crow era, into the Civil Rights era, and even into today, that psychological impact of dehumanizing African American women, dehumanizing African American men because they need to be protected from white women, that sticks with people today, even though we weren't alive in the slavery era.
Right. No,
you know what I
it's
mean?
passed on. Yeah, I agree.
Right.
And that trauma continues on. You mentioned in your notes, too, that rape back then was specifically limited to white women under the law.
It was.
Up until when? Has that changed, presumably? I mean, I realize, and we'll get into the subtleties that have been brought in, but the law itself, does it recognize that a black woman can be raped now?
By the letter of the law.
Yeah.
Right. By the letter of the law, it does now. Back then it was considered actually the only crime that could be prosecuted was trespass because they were the property of someone else, so you were trespassing against someone's property. Now,
Wow.
like legally, it is.
Wait a minute. If somebody raped the neighbor's slave woman,
Right.
they would
If
be
they did
charged
not
with
have
trespassing.
permission. Now,
Right.
I mean, because.
Oh, yeah, right. Okay.
But the owner of said property, which sounds ridiculous to say out loud,
I know.
could allow it. But if he did not allow it, he could. In my research, I found that because it was trespass against property, there could be. But it literally was like that woman. She, in no way was she dignified or given any sort of humanity. She was
No.
literally treated just like the cattle, just like the land, just like anything else. So she was in no way human. So, and that has continued on. Even the father of modern gynecology experimented on black women without anesthesia for years. That's how we have the treatments that we have today, is because of the experiences of these black women. And one of them was as young as 17 when he started these very, very brutal, grotesque experiments on these women. And though not rape, very, very similar. And that for a long time he's been praised for his work, and only recently has anyone ever questioned what he did to these women, and the fact that we are where we are today because of what they gave of their bodies.
Okay, and you're talking about James Marion Sims, right?
Correct, yes.
Who lived during the slavery era,
Mm-hmm.
1813 to 1883. And yes, he's called the father of modern gynecology.
Mm-hmm.
And according to your presentation, like you said, he experimented on black women
Exactly.
without anesthesia.
And without their consent.
Right. And you have one note here where he performed 30 operations on one 17-year-old woman.
Operations without
Operations
anesthesia,
without anesthesia.
in their women areas.
Yeah.
So-
And that even continues. That example there with the doctor plays into the overall picture of what happens when our system fails to recognize that every woman and all women, including women who are African American, deserve protection under our laws. Because if we allow our judicial system to constantly reinforce that African American women don't deserve equality and equity under our law, that can fold over to, employment discrimination, medical bias, saying African American women can tolerate a more heightened level of pain than that of white women, or they, are somewhat deserving to bear that pain compared to that of, what a white woman should be able to bear. So it all ties into a larger problem, even though we're specifically highlighting the issues surrounding the disparities in rape.
Right, and speaking to the medical bias, the rates of maternal mortality are astronomically higher for black women, and that's something that needs to be explored because they aren't given the same level of treatment by medical providers, and you have to wonder if that's based in a lot of this work that James Marion Sims did. And so just like people want to say, oh, well, slavery's over, this is over, but the foundation has been laid. The building is on, quicksand. It's not, we are not, as we build, we continue to sink. So we just have to keep going and going. It's
Okay,
not
the disparities in the care for white women, though, is that within the same economic class or level?
Are you talking
'cause
about medically, or are you talking
Yeah,
about
medically.
legally? Well, I know nationally. This is something I studied apart from this class because I used to be a childbirth coach. But yeah, nationally, statistically, data says that black women have exponentially higher rates of maternal mortality during childbirth and leading up to childbirth and after childbirth. And so those rates are, I think, very much when I started looking into Mr. Sims, the gynecologist, I feel like just like the legal system built this foundation of not honoring black women who are raped, the medical system has also built the same foundation of not honoring black women in that regard.
It seems to me it's basically the legacy of racism in America.
Mm-hmm.
It goes. I mean, we talk about. I mean, for one thing, I wanted to point out I cannot believe, or have a hard time believing, that anybody thought that black women or black people don't feel pain, which was Sims's justification for
Right.
performing these experiments. That just blows me away. But that's all part of the thing, that they're beasts, they're animals, all that kind of thing. And of course, back in the '60s when PCP, a particular drug, was available, you can't stop a black man on PCP. Somehow they become superhuman. They go from being an inferior human to whatever. But
and that's still today. I mean, you've seen that even with police shootings. They say the guy was on drugs, and that was
he was crazed.
He was a crazed maniac, but they don't. It's not treated equally,
No.
for.
Getting back to Mr. Sims, there was a statue of him put up for a long time.
Yeah, it
and
just
it was
recently came
controversial.
down.
Yeah, it came down in August of last year. Just how is all this going to? How is it relevant today, as far as changing people's minds, though?
Mr. Sims in particular, all
of this history, yeah. I think we might have already covered that, though.
Well, I think just people need to recognize in general I feel like we were very quick to pat ourselves on the back as white people in America of look how far we've come and look at the good we've done, but we are not quick to recognize the role that we have played in all of it and see where, no, I did not own a slave. However, now today, what am I doing to perpetrate these same types? Am I dismantling these systems? Am I using my privilege? What am I doing to really change things for today? Because if you look at our criminal justice system and how many people of color are incarcerated, how many, black women's crimes have, against them have been still erased today, we can see that we really haven't come as far as we think we have. And there are roles that we can all play in that, whether they're conversations at work or on the water cooler, or whether they're running for office, or whatever they are, supporting black women who are running for office, who are getting things done. What can we do to help start to really change systems?
Right. Okay.
It's always easier to, highlight and talk about how successful we have been and how far we have come with the development of our laws. That's always the easier route to take, and it's much harder to, number one, take it upon yourself and ask other people to acknowledge that there's a problem with the application in our laws. There's a problem with how, as Americans, both black and white, do we come together and try and tackle the psychological damage that has been instilled into us from the beginning of our history in order to change everyone's mindset, both black and white,
Yes.
in moving forward in our judicial system. And that's the hardest thing that, we are going to have to overcome and try and tackle in order for us to truly say, this is the progress that we have made. This is how far we have come from the slavery era, and recognizing African Americans as people, as being humane.
Yes, and as far as a black woman being raped by a white man, say, and going to trial, the racism kind of comes in there again with the juries, right?
Well,
At
it
least
starts
with
from the
white
very
juries.
beginning. It starts from the very beginning because a lot of times the police officer doesn't believe the story. The police officer is not going to go arrest a white man for raping a black woman for whatever reason. So it starts there. Then you go to the prosecutor. Is the prosecutor going to actually bring charges? Suddenly, this case seems less viable as one where if a white woman accuses a black man, how many times have we seen that happen where there was no evidence? And that's one thing that we have found is that it literally takes a mountain of evidence to get anything done for a white man who's accused of raping a black woman. However, if a black man is accused of raping a white woman, all you need is the word of that white woman and literally nothing else, and he can spend the rest of his life in prison, or in the past he could have been executed in a variety of ways, whether that was lynching during that period or whether it's now judicial lynching through capital punishment. But regardless, the disparity is huge when it comes to the evidence necessary. So it goes from the police officer to the prosecutor to now the jury, as you were saying, or the judge, and whether the jury actually finds them guilty, whether the judge gives them any sort of pertinent sentence that's of any relevance. And it really, that's why I do believe that getting people into office, people don't realize how much those judgeships matter. They don't realize how much jury service matters. They don't realize showing up for jury duty matters, and this is life or death for people. We don't think about the fact that these people are literally going to spend the rest of their life, and they may have not actually done this this crime. So it could have been your brother, your sister, and your brother as the accused, your sister as the victim. And we really just have to think about the totality of where our system is sitting at
right.
this moment.
And again, education and information like this is very important. Some of the examples you cited with black men or boys being accused of raping white women or less. Emmett Till, prime example, 14-year-old kid who was accused of whistling at a white woman.
Right.
And he was brutally beaten, And was there anybody ever prosecuted for that?
They were actually indicted and charged with murder, but they were acquitted of all of their charges because they did have an all-white jury.
Right.
They were never indicted or charged with the kidnapping
Okay.
of Emmett Till, and they actually, published their story of how they brutalized this young man and tortured him.
Okay.
And the woman actually has now, she's very late in life, in her 80s, I think, or 90s, has recanted and said that she made the whole thing up.
That long, huh?
But nobody ever, and in fact, somebody's uncle, whether it's I think it's one of the guys who killed him, is now the governor of Mississippi. So
I need to check that out. And there was another one, George Stinney, who was wrongfully committed of murdering a 7 and 11-year-old white girl, 7 and 11-year-old white girls. And his conviction was vacated in 2014, but he was executed.
He was the youngest person to ever be executed in America, and
that was in Louisiana, wasn't it?
I can't remember where it was, but there's pictures of him with. It goes, this is an electric chair, and they couldn't even retrofit the stuff around his head to make it actually. They had to just. It was absolutely
absurd.
Inhumane the way that they treated that child and so many other kids and adults throughout the system. Central Park 5, the way that they were treated, many.
Was that the rape back in like the 80s?
Of the woman in Central Park. And
the
in
jogger,
fact,
Central Park
there's
jogger.
There's Ava DuVernay who did 13th and Selma. She created I think it's for Netflix, but it's gonna be like a 5-part series on the Central Park 5, and they were involved in it, and it's telling their side of the story. So that's one of very few instances where they have been released, and now they are all working in some capacity to make the world a better place for other people, to make sure this doesn't happen again.
Okay, now I recall the coverage of that
event,
rape, the event back then. I mean, and back then, by the way, I was a right-wing nut job, so but I distinctly recall the outrage. There's a roaming pack of animals, that kind of thing. Those terms were used back then, and it created a picture.
Our president, who was not our president at the time, took out that giant whole-page ad in, I think it was the New York Times or some major publication back then, about when I can't remember if it was when they had said that at some point, like making sure that their faces were everywhere, their story was everywhere, dehumanizing them, sticking by them. Even when there was evidence that they didn't do it, he still really pushed that it had to be them, and there couldn't have been. And it's the whole narrative, like you were saying, about the beasts and the animals, and it's the stripping away of the humanity piece by piece, and we continue to still see that in our news coverage today. If you pull up any of our local stations, the way that headshots or mugshots are presented, it's just, you can see it. It's very, very clear, and it's if you're looking. If you're not looking, then it just looks like any other day. So
yeah, and it hurts me a lot of times when I watch local television to see how many black faces are there, and I often wonder, well, didn't any white people commit crimes today? And yet a Baton Rouge police officer was filmed beating a teenager at Earth Day a couple of years ago, and then murdered Alton Sterling.
Exactly.
And still going on. But
that is coming up. His civil service board.
Yes,
hearing.
he's going to be. Yes, and I'm hoping that I can be there, and that should be publicized. Anyway, one of the things. Okay, lynchings you mentioned. You have a statistic here that I wanted to ask you about. You said that between 1880 and 1950, around 5,000 people were lynched. Was this just in Louisiana?
No, I believe that was
around the whole country.
Around the whole country, yeah.
As I understand it, Louisiana led the country in the
It
number
was
of
one of the
lynchings.
highest
yes.
lynching.
Yeah.
Us, Alabama, Mississippi, I think
Yeah.
were the top three, of course. It sounds about right for today if you look at extrajudicial lynchings of, police officers murdering unarmed black people. It's a lot of times it has continued.
Victor White III, committing suicide by shooting himself in the chest with his hands cuffed behind his back. Yeah, and that happens a lot in America. Now, your notes here also state that Louisiana's legal provisions back then mandated capital punishment for both the rape and the attempted rape of a white female by a slave. It was also after slavery was ended, too, though, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was only in the 70s where the laws were changed where rape was considered not equivalent to a capital punishment sentence.
And one of the facts you had in your deal was Louisiana executed 14 people for rape between 1941 and 1971. All 14 were black. And 13 of them were executed for raping a white woman.
And that's a very powerful statement, because even though that was between 1940 and 1970, it kind of, makes you think how much of that is still going on today, because there are, men who have been sitting in prison for 20 years, for 30 years, who are convicted of rape, and their victim was a white woman. So it just makes you wonder that this problem is still existing today, and how many innocent men are sitting in jail because they didn't actually commit this crime, but their accuser was a white woman. And throughout history, that's all it has taken is her word.
Yeah.
And also to note with that, one thing that we have considered in our research is that though you don't necessarily get the death penalty, you die in prison.
Yeah,
and
you're
so
life imprisonment.
you are either life imprisonment or you're of an age where the case that we started our research in, he was sentenced to 100 years. Well, I mean, that's a death sentence. But the case we originally were studying was a man who was sentenced to 100 years in prison, and so that ends up being a death sentence no matter what age you are. And there are so many men in prison who have been sentenced to these very excessively long penalties or end up serving out the rest of their life in prison, and so that is still a death sentence. And if those men were innocent, then where does that
even worse? Yeah.
Where does that leave us?
Right. And we keep focusing on the power of a white woman's word, and you can also flip that in the vice versa. And remember that rape, no matter who it's against or how it happens, is about power. And so if you have a black man who's accused of raping a white woman, and the power of her word alone is enough to convict him to a death sentence, if you flip that and say throughout history a white man has been able to exert power over an African American woman, and so this can toll over into the larger scheme of things, saying a black woman, is she comfortable enough to come forward with these crimes if it just so happens that who she's reporting this crime to is a white man? Does she almost unwillingly, without noticing that she's doing it constantly, just kind of think, oh, this white man thinks he has power over me, or because he's white, he's not going to believe me. Going to trial, the way that victims are questioned while they're on the stand, especially going back in time when they're black women being questioned by a white prosecutor in front of an all-white jury, they're almost symbolically being raped again, because it's all about an imbalance of power. I had a white man exert power over my physical body. Now I'm sitting here on trial, and I have a prosecutor attacking me, putting power over me again with the questions that he's asking.
There was a young black woman in your presentation. I'm looking for here in the notes.
Betty Jean Owens.
Yes. She was kidnapped and gang raped and they put her through all that. She had to recount
Correct.
in front of the jury details of.
And then
the
you
act.
hear questions like, well, didn't you like it?
Yeah.
You know, do you ever ask a white woman who's accusing a black man of being raped, like, didn't you like it? No, you don't hear that because you have dehumanized black men as beasts. And so, of course, you couldn't like it. But white men are put up on this pedestal, so if they touch a black woman, it's like, oh, well, of course you liked it. And they're not believed. And so that's like Chelsea was saying, there's not a reason for them to even come forward, because who are they going to tell that's going to actually believe them?
Well, we're out of time. You've been listening to Wayne Parker on A Pause for Thought. I've been talking with Megan Matt and Chelsea Hale from Southern University Law Center. We thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
You all have a good night.